Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the row blown up in Labour as a result of the whip being withdrawn from 7 serial rebels in the party over the two-child universal credit cap. Not that all of them seem to realise that's what it's about, and the SNP amendment to the King's Speech. Now, I think this is a strategic mistake from Starmer and the Labour whips, which I'm going to go over, but my aim is always to try and make sense of what's happening so that, you can make your own decisions. Let's go over the various factors which have led to this in order to make sense of it. But I am going to say this is the dumbest internal party row I can remember. And this video will be a bit longer, there's way more I could have said, but there is a lot to it that people aren't considering. Now, there are two aspects of this. There's the policy itself, and then there's the issue of party discipline, which is, what causes the whips to be withdrawn. Let's go over the nuances of the policy first. The first is that a number of MPs, including some of these Labour rebels, supporting the SNP amendment to remove the two-child cap, didn't even know what they were voting for. Liz Saville-Roberts applied, talking about the decision not to scrap the two-child benefit cap. There is no two-child benefit cap. The Tories would not put a cap on child benefit. That would hurt what used to be their core support. That would be mad. Doesn't exist. And she wasn't the only one. Stephen Flynn, who's literally leading the amendment because he's the leader of the SNP in Westminster, he didn't know either. He referred to the two-child benefit cap when he stood up for the debate. It doesn't exist. The two-child cap, when we talk about the two-child cap, it's a cap on universal credit, not child benefit, different things. So the first thing to note is that senior politicians pushing this amendment, and there were a few others as well, it wasn't just those, either didn't understand what the amendment was even for, or they were deliberately being dishonest in misrepresenting it. I didn't see the precise wording of the amendment itself. It's always quite hard to find. You can find it if you're really interested. It doesn't matter. I'm quite prepared to accept that the amendment itself did make sense, that it's accurate, in which case these MPs were lying rather than ignorant. If the amendment did what they were talking about in the debate itself, then even if it had passed, it wouldn't have achieved anything because there is no child benefit cap. Now, that is not to say that what does exist, the two-child cap on universal credit, is fine. It's not fine. But it's also worth noting that it is effectively Labour policy to remove it anyway. It's true to say it wasn't in the manifesto, so it's not certain when or if, but that is because they went out of their way to make sure the manifesto was watertight in terms of financing. Could they have dropped another commitment, a less important commitment, in order to make room for this one? Absolutely, but there's a reason why they didn't. As I've pointed out for a long time now, the two-child cap is popular with voters, including Labour voters. This may be difficult for some people to get their heads around, but that is a fact. And this has not changed from the polling. So in the past, I've referred to polling from last year, which not only is a year old now, but also would have referred to 2019 Labour voters. Now there's bang up to date polling on it showing support for the policy, even amongst 2024 Labour voters. So in terms of the MPs who maybe did know what they were talking about in the debate yesterday, because they all have been ignorant, and actually wanted Labour to remove the actual two-child cap, not the fantasy one that MPs like Flynn seems to think exists for child benefit. What they were asking the government to do was to try doing what Liz Truss did and seeing if it works out any better for them. Except instead of unfunded tax cuts, it's unfunded spending. But that distinction doesn't matter. After years of persuading the public that every bit of spending will be fully funded, you don't suddenly renege on that on day one if you wish to win the next election. Remember, the Tories are always given the benefit of the doubt as the default party of fiscal responsibility. They have to mess up pretty badly to lose it, as they just have done. Labour, on the other hand, are considered the default party of, taxes spend, and they have to bend over backwards to convince voters otherwise when they decide they'd like to stop being in opposition for a generation at a time. But when you listen to what the Labour leadership have been saying, and saying ever since the election, this is not new, it's been that the cap is going, we want it to go, but it will go when we can demonstrate it's affordable. And that should have been really encouraging, because how do you demonstrate that it's affordable? What they're basically saying is it will go as part of a budget statement after a spending review when they can announce it alongside an independent Office for Budgetary Responsibility report saying, yeah, this is all fully costed. If Labour announce it before that budget statement, it's an unfunded spending promise. Political suicide. So it's no surprise that the Labour MPs who did rebel are those most closely associated with political suicide. They are most closely attached to the project which virtually killed off the Labour Party at the last election. However, removing the whip, I still think is an error. Let's go over this aspect of it now, because there's both an optics and a discipline dimension to this. First of all, I'm going to assume Labour issued a 3-line whip against voting for this amendment. If so, nobody gets to complain about having the whip removed. That is the whole point of the 3-line whip. It is, you are going to vote the way we tell you. This is really important. And they don't do that for every vote. But this is important. This is part of our core offer to voters. And part of the core offer to voters wasn't this specific policy, but it was this: all of our spending will be fully funded, right? That being said, what those MPs were voting for is effectively already Labour policy. So given that senior Labour MPs from Starmer down have said they want to get rid of it, the government clearly feel they can remove it, and they can be open about removing it despite public approval for the policy, as long as they do it in the right way. This amendment was not the right way, but it's for the same policy. It just looks mad. After, Parliament's been open for a week, and Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister, has effectively reduced his majority by 14 in order to punish MPs who have voted for a policy he supports. The only disagreement between them is that the 7 Muppet rebels wanted Starmer to do it in a way that lets the Tories increase their chances of a return. But that's what they do. They're political idiots. Actually, as an aside, it's worth noting that Rosie Duffield said that she would have voted for the amendment had she been well enough to attend Parliament. I wonder how many people would be complaining if the action had caught her in the net. But she wasn't. She's got COVID, so she carries on shooting her mouth off from the Labour benches once she's no longer got COVID. And so the optics remain terrible. People will look at this in different ways, none of it good. Yes, there are some in Labour who approve of this because this particular group of MPs are 100% made up of people who are of zero benefit to the Labour Party. They're actual drag. Several of them are directly responsible for the previous Tory Parliament. They've all taken from Labour, given nothing back. But it's worth remembering when Labour were last in power, Blair was being urged to withdraw the whip from Corbyn because he kept voting with the Tories against his government. And Blair said no, because we need to have these different views within the party. So, the point there was Blair didn't feel threatened by a political idiot voting against him on his own benches. He just ignored him. And the same should apply here. So why did Starmer do it? Well, rank stupidity to just dismiss it as over-the-top reaction. There's always a reason. The reason is, of course, party discipline. They've said it themselves. They've been open about it and said, we want to make it clear, you stood on a manifesto and you are going to deliver that manifesto. And part of that manifesto was no unfunded spending commitments. And if you announce that you're getting rid of the cap right now, that would be an unfunded spending commitment. So from that point of view, that's fair enough. The question is, however, strategically, where is this discipline directed? Is it directed at the rebels or against future potential rebels? If it's against the 7 MPs in question, it's possible Starmer is basically telling them he's not going to let anything slide. And if they expect to be Labour candidates at the next election, they'd better start being a bit smarter. Because although no MP gets to complain about losing the whip if they vote against a 3-line whip, and again, I'll just say, I'm assuming this must have been the case, otherwise it would be completely mad. There's never been a government who routinely withdraws the whip for rebellion, even against a 3-line whip. It's like, because it's a big move, withdrawing the whip. If a vote looks tight, yes, the government might threaten to withdraw the whip from any rebels. And then if they've done that, they have to follow up. So if Labour whips did make that threat and those rebels voted the way they did anyway, there really is no complaint at all. But I don't know. I go back to the core reason why this dance is going on. Labour want to remove the cap. The public support the cap. And Labour won an election largely on a promise of no unfunded spending promises. The cap could be gone in the very first budget. That's the earliest you can realistically do it anyway. It's a spending matter, so it's for a budget. So I'd have supported any move Starmer needed to make sure the amendment failed. And we know Labour MPs in general want the cap removing. I don't know of any Labour MPs who actually support it. It's the single quickest way to alleviate a significant cause of child poverty in up to 300,000 children. It doesn't remove those children from poverty. It doesn't even affect the majority of children in poverty, because like 1.6 million of them. But it helps a lot very quickly. However, even if threats were issued, I still don't think they should have acted in this case. Because the reality was, 7 Labour MPs rebelled. I mean, that's really not anything to make a fuss about. The whips wouldn't have lost face by not following through for the sake of 7 political idiots when the rest either voted with the government or abstained. And it's not even like that many abstained. And the point has been made that this now makes it trickier to implement the policy this autumn because they've now made such a big fuss about it. Now, I don't agree exactly with that characterisation. I agree this fiasco makes it harder now for Labour to remove the cap this autumn. But the fault is with the rebels. Whether or not they had the whip withdrawn, they were putting this in the news spotlight, regardless. Just as with Brexit, anything the government want to do that is good policy, but voters are split on, it's best done quietly. It's the rebels that are making this politically hot and therefore difficult for Labour to just quietly remove the cap this autumn. As I said, political idiots who are financially insulated from the consequences of their own hubris and stupidity. They've basically facilitated an amendment which the MP put forward just to try and trip Labour up, which is fine. They're an opposing party. It's less fine for the MPs of the party the amendment is designed to attack. But that does not lessen the strategic error on the part of Starmer in the whips here, because they've now put a lot of Labour MPs' noses out of joint with the withdrawal of the whips. The dissatisfaction goes beyond, quite a lot beyond the 7 affected. It's also raised the profile of the policy, making it harder to remove without looking like they've backed down to pressure when they've spent the last 2 weeks saying, we're going to remove it, but at the right time. Labour have created a row over a policy on which the party is actually united. And when they stood no serious prospect of losing the vote, at worst, they would have faced headlines of a large rebellion. There might have been a few dozen Labour MPs vote with the amendment. Not ideal. That's not great headlines, but I don't think it's as bad as reporting on a split within the party over something they all agree on. And as much as this is ultimately the fault, as I say, of that small group of idiots, you expect idiots to do idiotic things. They've done idiotic things for years. You do expect the grown-ups in the room to just ignore the bad behaviour when they can. As for suspending the whip for 6 months pending review, I mean, that just makes it even weirder. So we could end up in a situation now where Rachel Reeves announces the removal of the cap this autumn, and those MPs are still suspended for voting for it. What happens then? Then you have another argument between those who point out how ridiculous the suspensions were because Labour did the thing they voted for, or those who point out how ridiculous the rebellions were because Labour did it anyway and had already announced they were going to do it anyway. Even the Tories didn't have an internal row this stupid. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.